Hello, everyone. My name is Alaa Kamil, and I serve as the designated federal official for the Science Advisory Committee on Chemicals, peer review of EPA's draft risk evaluation for di-isodecyl phthalate, the DIDP, and the draft hazard assessments for di-isononyl phthalate, the DINP. And I also would like to welcome everyone to today's virtual preparatory meeting. As the DFO for this meeting, I serve as a liaison between the peer reviewers and the agency. Also in my role as DFO, a critical responsibility is to work with the appropriate agency officials to ensure that all appropriate ethics regulations are satisfied. In that capacity, reviewers are briefed on the provisions of the federal conflict of interest laws, and each peer reviewer has filed a government confidential financial disclosure report, which has been reviewed to ensure all ethics requirements are met. This is a preparatory meeting focused on the scope and clarity of the charge questions, of the draft charge questions. We would like to thank the public for attending and for providing the comments. We have one public commenter who registered to make a brief comment today related to the clarity and the scope of the charge questions. The agency appreciates peer reviewers' time and the diligent work in preparing for this meeting, and also the public for attending and sending comments. Please be advised that the agenda times are approximate. When the discussion for one topic is completed, the discussions for the next topic will begin. I also wish to thank my EPA colleagues for all their efforts preparing for this meeting. So joining me during this meeting, during this session, are Steve Knott, the peer reviewer, the peer review and ethics branch. He's the branch chief at the Office of Program Support, Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention in EPA. We also have Tamio Gibson, the executive secretary of the FIFRA Scientific Advisory Panel and the SAC. We have Dr. Charlene Manton, is an assistant deputy ethics official and a DFO for the SAC and the FIFRA SAP. William Wogi is also an assistant deputy ethics official and a DFO for the SAC and the FIFRA SAP. Ali Munir is a DFO for the SAC and the FIFRA SAP. We also have Joyce Coates and Barbara Ewell, and the EPA contractor Indina, who will provide administrative support. With us also today, the EPA Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics team, who will be presenting today. The SAC chair, Dr. Cobb, will lead us in a few minutes and introduce the SAC members and peer reviewers. So regarding this meeting operations, we will ensure adequate time for the agency presentations, for the public comments, and for peer reviewers to discuss their questions with agency presenters and public commenters. The meeting is being recorded and webcasted over the internet via YouTube and by teleconference for audio. Speakers are asked to state their names and affiliations before they start speaking. There is a public docket for this meeting listed in the meeting agenda, and copies of all meeting materials and public comments will be available at regulations.gov under the docket numbers listed in the federal notices and as stated earlier. We may display the agenda now if possible. We posted a draft agenda at the meeting at regulations.gov under the same docket number. In addition, links to the meeting information and supporting documents for this meeting are also available on the SAC website and are listed in the meeting agenda. Please keep in mind, this meeting is only for points of clarification regarding the charge, not for reviewer or public discussion of technical information or the peer reviewer or the peer review documents. Again, I wish to thank the reviewers for your participation in today's meeting. I will turn it over to our esteemed chair, Dr. George Cobb. Dr. Cobb.
Thank you, Alaa. And I'd like to start out by welcoming all of those from the public who are joining us today, and thanking the OPPT staff, and Allah and his colleagues for helping to organize this particular meeting and all of the efforts that we are working through with this committee. I'd like to thank our committee members who are working on this phthalate review that we're discussing today. So with that, I'll start with our roll call or our introductions. I am George Cobb. I am an analytical environmental chemist. I'm a professor and department chair in the Department of Environmental Science at Baylor University. And now we'll go through our committee members. Dr. Apte.
Hello, my name is Udayan Apte. I'm a professor at the Department of Pharmacology, Toxicology, and Therapeutics at the University of Kansas Medical Center, and my expertise is in liver toxicology.
Thank you. Dr. Baker. Dr. Chason.
Hello, my name is Christine Chason. I am retired from the Lifeline Group, and I was trained in cellular biochemistry and toxicology, but my professional interests have been exposure and probabilistic modeling. Thank you.
Dr. Ike. Dr. Fong.
Hi, good morning. My name's Art Fong, and I am the technical leader for Smarter Chemistry at Apple. And currently I work on topics related to green and sustainable chemistry. Thank you very much.
Dr. Gentry.
Hello, my name is Robin Ann Gentry. I'm a toxicologist and principal with Ramble America's Environment and Health, and my expertise is in the area of human health risk assessment.
Thank you. Dr. Graham.
Hello, I'm Cynthia Graham. I'm an independent toxicology consultant. My expertise is in respiratory and dermal sensitization. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Jenkins.
Hello, I'm Allison Jenkins. I'm a senior regulatory toxicologist at the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality in Austin. Thank you.
Dr. Lee. Okay. Dr. Merced Nieves.
Hello, my name is Francesca Merced Nieves. I'm an assistant professor at Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in the Departments of Public Health and Environmental Medicine and Climate Science, and my expertise is in neurotoxicology.
Dr. Messerlian. Dr. Ottinger. She may have.
I'm right here.
Oh, you got back.
Oh, yeah, no, I sent you a note. Anyway, hello, I'm Marianne Ottinger. I'm a professor emeritus and research professor at the University of Houston in the Department of Biology and Biochemistry. My expertise is endocrinology, endocrine disruptors, and ecotoxicology. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Prisbilla.
Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Prisbilla. I am an environmental health scientist with the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry, and my expertise is in human health risk assessment. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Reif.
I'm David Reif. I'm a chief of the predictive toxicology branch at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, and my expertise is in bioinformatics and computational biology.
Thank you. Dr. Shamel Elliott. Mr. Wright cannot join us today. Dr. David.
Hi, my name is Ray David. I'm a retired toxicologist from industry. And I've been working with phthalates since the early 90s. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Fanning? Okay. Dr. Fenner Crisp?
Hi, I'm Penny Fenner Crisp. I'm an independent consultant now living in Charlottesville, Virginia. My areas of expertise are toxicology, human health risk assessment, and science policy and guidance. Prior to retiring and becoming an independent consultant, I spent 22 years at EPA in the drinking water, toxics, and pesticide programs.
Thank you. Dr. Hattershell?
Kimber Howdeshell. I am a developmental and reproductive toxicologist with a specialty in endocrine disrupting chemicals. I'm with the National Institute of Environmental Health Science and the Division of Translational Toxicology.
Thank you. Dr. Schumann Goodyear? Dr. Spade? Okay, Dr. Wolf was not going to be able to join us. I see Dr. Fanning is with us. Can you introduce yourself? She's having audiovisual difficulties. Perhaps we can get to her later. And if our AV folks can try to get that aligned. Is there anybody on the committee or an ad hoc who I did not call? Please rate. Oh, how did I miss? Wendy, how did I miss you? Dr. Heiger Bernays. I thought I called your name.
Hi, I'm Wendy Heiger Bernays. I'm faculty at the Boston University School of Public Health. My training is in toxicology and risk assessment, and my expertise is molecular mixtures assessment. Thank you.
Okay, and I see Dr. Martinez as well.
Hi, my name is Janelle Martinez, and I'm a principal scientist at B. Braun Pharmaceutical and Chemistry R&D, and I have over 25 years of human health risk assessment experience with state, local, and national entities.
Thank you. So I think that's everyone, and I'll turn it back over to Ala.
All right, thank you, Dr. Cobb. Thank you for all the SAC members and ad hoc reviewers. And at this time, I would now turn to our agency speaker, Anthony Luz, who will give us the overview of the technical presentation of the Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics in EPA. And the presentation, if it's ready, we can start.
Thanks, Ala. I'm not seeing the slides up on the screen yet. Were those going to get shared?
Yes.
Yes.
Not this one.
We do not have the slide deck for the EPA.
Colin, can you just give us 1 second and we can get the slides pulled up on our end? I apologize.
I have the slides up.
I apologize for the confusion. We'll have the slides pull up here in just a sec. I think one of the EPA team members just sent a request to take over the screen share to share the slides.
Yep, they have permission. Are they able to share?
We are sharing right now, I believe. Got it?
Yeah, if I can figure out how to.
I got it. What's up?
Oh, you got it? Okay.
Confirming we can see your slide.
Excellent. Thank you. Great. Thank you, everyone. Again, I apologize for that mix-up. My name is Anthony Luz, and I'm a biologist in EPA's Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics Existing Chemicals Risk Assessment Division, and I'm the assessment lead for the manufacturer requested risk evaluations for both di-isodecyl phthalate or DIDP, isononyl phthalate or DINP. So first off, thank you all for joining this preparatory meeting for the peer review of the 2024 draft risk evaluation DIDP and the draft human and environmental health hazards for DINP. So for this preparatory meeting, I'll start by giving some brief background on DIDP and DINP, and then we'll get into EPA's charge to the SAC. Next slide, please. I think that's the wrong slide, Colin.
This is the slide deck for this charge questions.
I apologize. We're having some more technical issues here. Give us 1 second. We have the wrong.
Yep. This is it.
All right, we are back. Again, I am sorry for that interruption. Can we go on to the next slide, please, Jen? Okay, so TSCA Section 6 allows manufacturers of chemical substances and/or categories of chemical substances to request an EPA-conducted risk evaluation on the chemical substance and/or category of chemical substances on the conditions of use of interest to the manufacturers requesting the evaluation. So on May 24th, 2019, under the old TSCA risk evaluation rule, EPA received a request from ExxonMobil Chemical Company, Evonik Corporation, and Technor-Apex through ACC's high phthalates panel to conduct a risk evaluation for DINP, while a similar request for risk evaluation of DIDP was also received on May 24th, 2019 from ExxonMobil Chemical Company, again through ACC's high phthalates panel. So EPA reviewed the manufacturer requests for DIDP and DINP and approved the requests in December 2019, and then subsequently issued draft and final scope documents for the DIDP and DINP risk evaluations in 2020 and 2021. So following publication of final scopes, the next step in the risk evaluation process is to issue draft risk evaluations for peer review and public comment, which is why we're all here today. Next slide, please. Okay. So for both the DIDP and DINP risk evaluations, they're organized into a series of discipline-specific technical support documents that summarize the technical analyses and information that will in turn feed into the draft risk evaluations. So this slide provides an overview of the draft DIDP risk evaluation package submitted to the docket for peer review. First, you'll note that the draft technical support documents summarizing the physical, chemical, and fate properties of DIDP. So these support documents feed into EPA's environmental exposure assessment and human exposure assessments. So there are 3 technical support documents summarizing human exposure assessments, including environmental media and general population exposure assessments, an environmental release and occupational exposure assessment, and a consumer and indoor dust exposure assessment. So these 3 human exposure assessments, in conjunction with the DIDP human health hazard assessment, feed into the human health risk characterization for DIDP and the risk evaluation. Similarly, the DIDP environmental hazard assessment and environmental exposure assessment both feed into the environmental risk characterization section of the DIDP risk evaluation. So as part of the charge to the SAC, EPA is requesting peer review of a number of aspects of the underlying technical support documents supporting the DIDP risk evaluation. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide summarizes the document map for the draft DINP risk evaluation. Please note that the draft DINP risk evaluation will be organized in a similar fashion to the draft DIDP risk evaluation. However, for DINP, the agency has only released 5 draft technical support documents to the docket as part of the current peer review. These technical support documents are highlighted with green boxes in the slide and include EPA's draft non-cancer human health hazard assessment, draft cancer human health hazard assessment, physical chemistry and fate assessments, and environmental hazard assessments. The DINP exposure assessments are not included as part of the current charge or peer review because EPA is using the same methods and underlying tools for the DINP exposure assessments, which are also being used for the DIDP exposure assessments. And EPA is seeking feedback from the SAC on these methods as part of the current peer review. So for the technical support documents included in the current peer review, which again are highlighted with green boxes in the slide, the agency has issued several charge questions that the agency is seeking feedback from the SAC on. With that, we've come to the end of the agency's presentation, and I will turn it back over to Ala.
Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Laws? Has the public commenter joined, Kurt?
Hi, Allah. Christine did confirm that she was going to participate. I did ask her to join at 1:10. I just emailed. I don't see her online, but I don't.
Yes, I'm here. Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Okay.
So
We also
Dr.
have one
David has a
question.
question. Yeah, Dr. David has a question first.
But yes, I'm just curious about the draft risk assessment for DINP and why that was not included as part of this review. What is the status of that?
Hi, this is Anthony Lez with US EPA. Yes, so for DINP, just the hazard assessments and the Phthalate and PChem assessments are included in the current peer review. A lot of the same tools and methods that underlie the exposure assessments for both DIDP and DINP are being used, and we're asking charge questions on the tools as part of the charge to the SAC on the DIDP risk evaluation. The DINP draft will be issued for public comment later in the year.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Dr. Jason?
Given the answer by EPA, are we to frame our comments on the charge questions that would reflect on the DIN, how it could impact the approaches for DINP as well? And when you say it goes out for public comment, will there be a separate SAC review of the DINP? Thank you.
Hi, Colin Beecham here, US EPA. So first question, yes. So thank you. We would like you to think about impact, I guess, broader impacts as you go through answering the charge questions. The second portion of that, we're exploring options for this one. So we are planning for the as Tony said, we're planning on a public comment period later on in the year. So for DINP's risk of the rest of the DINP risk evaluation. Thanks.
So real quick, this is George Cobb. Based on the answers and what Dr. Chason asked, I would encourage all of those who are dealing with the risk evaluation from this assessment to consider how and if those recommendations should apply to the DINP evaluation as well. So please craft your comments and language in that fashion.
All right, we can move now to the public commenter. So if we can bring up the presentation, and Dr. Christine Palermo is going to present. She's from American Chemistry Council.
Christine, can you hear us?
Yes. So, yeah, but so the screen is now with the EPA team, I think. We need to put the presentation for American Chemistry Council on.
Switching it out.
All right, here you go.
Okay, great. Thank you. So hello and good afternoon. My name is Chrissy Palermo, and as was said, I'm here on behalf of the ACC High Phthalates panel to recommend expanding the scope of charge question 2A, which is relevant to the DINP assessment regarding the HED based on decreased fetal testicular testosterone. So the changes to the charge question, if you could go to the next slide there, are shown in blue on this slide. And the first addition is to request feedback on the sufficiency of the weight of evidence to conclude on the hazard potential of DINP to elicit adverse outcomes associated with rat phthalate syndrome. And the second recommendation is a modification to ask for feedback on the sufficiency of available evidence to inform deviation from the default interspecies uncertainty factor in the benchmark MOE. So I'll speak mostly about the reasons behind the first recommendation and just very briefly on the basis for the second one. So we're proposing the first modification because, in our view, a weight of evidence evaluation to conclude on the hazard potential of DINP has not yet been transparently performed, and we consider this important for the SAC to consider, as it will help inform their review of the other key elements of this charge question. So specifically, the selection of decreased fetal testicular testosterone as the basis of the HED is underpinned by EPA's preliminary conclusion that the weight of scientific evidence demonstrates that oral exposure to DINP can induce adverse effects on the developing male reproductive system. EPA does not include a weight of scientific evidence assessment in support of this conclusion in the DINP non-cancer hazard assessment document itself. Instead, the agency defers to the draft proposed approach for cumulative risk assessment of high priority phthalates, which they released in February of last year, and which I'll call the draft CRA going forward. The weight of evidence approach described in the draft CRA, however, is not fit for the purposes of the single substance risk evaluation for DINP. We conclude this because the weight of evidence in the draft CRA was evaluating toxicological similarity across chemistries to conclude on a cumulative chemical group. An assessment to support toxicological similarity through an observation of a common precursor event as presented in the draft CRA is not equivalent to a weight of evidence assessment to conclude on the ability of DINP to induce hazardous outcomes as a result of an impact on this common precursor event. So to provide a bit more detail to this point, the draft CRA states, and I quote, DINP was less potent at disrupting fetal testicular steroidogenesis, and subsequent apical outcomes associated with phthalate syndrome are either inconsistently reported or not reported at all, unquote. So while EPA recognized inconsistencies in the data on apical outcomes in the draft CRA, the agency did not clarify or reconcile how these inconsistencies relate to the hazard potential of DINP as part of the draft CRA effort. And reconciliation of low frequency, inconsistent, low magnitude findings, as well as weighing of negative data, are critically important for informing the likelihood that DINP can induce apical effects on the male reproductive system, which will inform reasonability of selecting testosterone as the basis of the HED within the context of this single substance risk evaluation for DINP. A point of emphasis is that the CRA remains in draft form, so it's not yet been revised to take into consideration of peer review input. And to this point, the SAC that reviewed the draft CRA provided recommendations to improve the transparency and clarity of the hazard characterization for individual substances, including a comprehensive review to establish whether sufficient evidence exists for each phthalate to support each toxic endpoint. And for DINP specifically, the SAC recognized that DINP's toxicological similarity is less consistent than other phthalates in the chemical group, and recommended EPA include additional discussion on why DINP was included, and that EPA should include criteria for assessing differing views in literature. So for these reasons and others that we've submitted to the docket, we're proposing the first modification. Regarding the second proposed modification to the charge question, while data-derived extrapolation factors tend to be beyond the sophistication undertaking in a screening level risk assessment, we are recommending EPA elicit feedback on the application of the default uncertainty factor for interspecies variability, given existing evidence supporting reduced sensitivity of humans to outcomes associated with rat phthalate syndrome. We are proposing this modification because we consider it useful for the SAC to provide perspective on the appropriateness and utility of this information in the benchmark MOE calculation. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Now we open the door for discussing the charge questions, and only what we're going to be discussing is the scope and clarity. If it's clear, anyone has a question, please ask the question. And now, if the EPA team can share again their presentation on the charge questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ala.
You're welcome.
All right, so we'll start with the charge questions on the DIDP risk evaluation, shown as charge question 1A, which has 4 parts. This pertains to the exposure assessment for DIDP. So EPA relied on data from several sources to derive consumer exposure estimates that include products representative of the conditions of use, as described in sections 1, 2, and 3 of the draft consumer and indoor dust exposure assessment for DIDP. So part 1 of this charge question, please comment on the strengths and uncertainties of the selected data and methods used in consumer products and indoor air exposure analyses. We can pause there to see if there's any questions or comments for clarification. Okay, I'm not hearing anything, so
we see Dr. Jason.
Yes, thank you. Based on or just conversation a moment ago, can I recommend that the text be slightly revised so it reflects the charge to the SAC to consider? I mean, this says most specifically DIDP, and so it will, I think, appear that we're outside of our scope of your request. Could you possibly revise that a little to say that this, because there are elements from the DINP that will come up in charge questions 1A and 1B that would be relevant at least to discuss. So maybe you could include the expectation that we would reflect on the DINP for our comments. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Chason. This is Anthony Luz again with EPA. So part 2 of this question, please include a consideration of the consumer exposure model assumptions for analysis of suspended and surface dust through inhalation ingestion routes of exposure. Are there any comments or questions for clarification here?
That's for A. But the same issue is going to come up in B as well. So
understood.
I don't know, however you'd like to handle it, but just so that it's clear to the public that you're requesting we reflect on DINP where appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so part 3 of charge question 1A. Please also comment on mouthing behavior input parameters related to estimating chemical migration to saliva for infants and toddlers. Are there any questions or requests for clarification on part 3 of this charge question? Okay, moving on to part 4 of charge question 1A. For the remaining phthalates, EPA anticipates potentially needing to refine the exposure assessment for consumer and indoor dust exposure. Please suggest exposure data sources, models, and related methods for estimating dermal, inhalation, and ingestion exposures to chemicals from consumer products that are reasonably available and can be conducted in a timely manner. Are there any questions or comments for clarification?
Dr. David, I see your hand.
Just a clarification. So I was this phrase for the remaining phthalates shows up later on as well. And since there is only one other remaining phthalate, you are pointing to DINP, not something in addition to that. Is that correct?
This is Anthony Luz with US EPA. I think we're thinking a little more broadly here. In addition to DINP, it would also be pertaining to the 5 remaining high priority substances. So the five additional phthalates.
So for the cumulative risk assessment.
Yes, all of the phthalates included in there as well.
And I guess I'm struggling with why you would do that in the context of these two.
I mean, here we're. I apologize.
I mean, this is focused on DINP and DIDP specifically. So, why are you opening it up to others?
Yeah, I think we are just looking for consistency in approaches used across the phthalates.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. David, this is George Cobb. Thank you for that question and the response from EPA. I think a clarification that the remaining phthalates being considered by EPA or being considered in cumulative risk assessments by EPA would be helpful here. And I do think that it is reasonable for the agency to, if you will, front run finding out what kinds of data we suggest that they use there is appropriate, especially since we have several phthalates experts on this panel. So that's I think that was a great question. I do want to follow up a little bit on Dr. Chasen's question and see if the committee and or the agency thinks it's better to break out the DINP into a separate question in the DINP section below. And I don't have a strong feeling one way or the other, but I think it's worth making sure we get it right for writing the report and responding in a way that will facilitate the writing from the agency. So first of all, I'd like to ask the EPA, is it preferable for us to put those DINP responses in charge question 1 for the DIDP, or to break them out and start another charge question within the DINP response?
This is Anthony Luz with EPA. I think it's our preference that, it's all contained in one charge question versus splitting it out into a separate charge question, because we haven't released the DINP consumer and indoor dust exposure assessment yet.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Chasen's got a question.
Just following up on that, Dr. Cobb, maybe EPA could at least list the other phthalates of particular emphasis, if you will, from their point of view. And the second thing is, this opens up a conversation that we've had before, but maybe EPA would like to clarify it or broaden their concerns. Once again, this focuses exclusively on their concept of consumer and indoor and sort of limited exposure venues. And certainly in several places in charge questions 1A and 1B, there will be conversation about other exposure opportunities that were not included in the conversations of the document. So if EPA needs to clarify based on that, fine, or we can handle it the way it is. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think there is room to put those comments within the 4 that are asked, but that it's possible that could place another sub question in there.
I agree. Just since we're clarifying it, making it broader, this may bring up other questions they'd like us to focus on. So I just wanted to point that toward their exposure. And I agree with you. We will bring those kinds of issues up within the context of what's written here, at least from our perspective, from the SAC perspective. If EPA has any particular needs, this might be a place to add it in. Thank you.
Does the agency have a response on that? Okay.
This is Anthony with EPA. We don't have a response. Thank you for the discussion.
Okay, thank you. I see Dr. Opti has a question, and I need to make sure we have the process right. I kind of am calling on people, but I think it's usually you or one of the EPA folks that's engaged in this dialogue. So I'm going to try to step away from that unless you say differently.
No, it's all the same. No, it doesn't matter. I'll continue. All right, Dr. Apte.
Thank you. This is Udayan Apte. I have a question about 1A4. The question is about, I'm trying to get a clarification. Is the question about using the same methods for other phthalates, or are we talking about actual data for other phthalates? And I'm assuming this is, the way it writes is about the methodology, correct?
Hi, this is Laura Karnavik, EPA, working on the exposure assessment for consumers. Yes, it would be about the methodology, the input parameters used in the methodology, in specific, the methods and the modeling tools that we used. As in terms of using that for other chemicals, other phthalates, it's a little tricky what you're asking because you haven't really seen yet the DIDP and other chemicals. So it would be more about the methodology, the approaches, and how they're used and employed in the assessment for consumer exposure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dr. David?
So I get the sense that there are a number of questions like this among the charge questions, at least as I recall. There are questions about methodologies, and this, as I mentioned before, this phrase of remaining phthalates is used a number of times. I wonder if it would make sense to organize the charge questions in a way that separates out a methodology charge question that applies to all the other phthalates that EPA is interested in, and then there are others that would focus only on DIDP and DINP. Is that a feasible thing to do?
This is Anthony with EPA. I think, there might be a way for us to add some clarification and flag the specific parts of this charge that are specific to DIDP, DINP versus the other phthalates. So we can, try to add some clarifications there.
All right, Dr. Cobb.
Yeah, I have, I guess, kind of a comment on EPA's response to whether item 4 is dealing with data or methods. I mean, the question clearly asks for data, but it also asks for models and methods. So I think it's broader than just methods, at least the way the question is stated. And I think it needs to kind of stay there because data sources is one interesting aspect, I think. So I just simply wanted to add that from my perspective.
This is Laura Karnavik. I can maybe add a little more clarification on that one. So specifically for the DIDP, the approach is used and the methodology, yes. If there are any considerations or any appropriate use of it, obviously we would like comments on that. In addition to that, the input parameters and data used to do the modeling effort, it's also brought on to for commenting. The sources of the data are very similar for a lot of the chemicals that we're going to be using, phthalates. So it kind of does apply when you start thinking about the next phthalates. And it would be good to hear about any sources of information, specifically sources of data like weight fractions and concentrations of the chemicals in the products. So that's the kind of data and the type of sources that would supply this information that could also help for the other chemicals. But specifically for DIDP still stands. But if there is any other types of data and other types of sources of data that can satisfy other phthalates, it would be good to know as well. But specifically stay on the DIDP, definitely. Thanks.
Okay, don't see any more.
Dr. Jason, you have a question on 1A?
Well, I just, would it be helpful, or does EPA think it'd be helpful if we first answered the charge questions specifically to DIDP and then answered as a subparagraph the same question as it could be related to DINP or other phthalates? I mean, would that be a useful way to for us to approach it for you?
Dr. Chason, yes, I think that would be a very useful way to approach answering that question. Thank you. All right, if there's no more questions on charge question 1A, we will move on to charge question 1B. This charge question again has 3 parts. So it's described in section 2 of the draft environmental media and general population exposure for DIDP. EPA used sentinel exposures to conduct a screening approach for the DIDP exposure assessment. So part 1 of this charge question, please comment on the strengths and uncertainties of the selected data and methods employed in the use of sentinel exposures in this screening approach. And pause there for any questions. See, Dr. Cobb has his hand up.
Yeah, and I don't know how to best frame this because I think the word availability needs to be in this, not just strengths and uncertainties, but availability, strengths and uncertainties of data. But I don't know that availability extends to methods. So however that can be reworded, even if it's broken up into two questions, one about data and one about methods, it's okay. Or if you're okay with it saying availability, strengths, and uncertainties of data and methods, that's fine too. But I think the methods are relatively well available. I think that's important. Yeah, that was my main comment. And I think the way these are framed, it gets us back into some of the underlying data in some sections that aren't mentioned here. But there's a lot of comments that are going to come from the supporting sections that feed this draft media population exposures. But I think that's capturable in the committee's comment.
So Dr. Jason or Tony, you want to respond to Dr. Cobb?
No, just for the record, I'm the lead discussant on B, I, and I. So is it okay if we handle these the same way as I just recommended earlier, which is to answer the question specifically for DIDP and then answer it again in our response for DINP plus other phthalates? Would that be all right?
Dr. Chason, yes, I think you just, as you suggested on charge question 1A, I think the same would apply here for 1B. Thank you.
All right. So we can move to the next one.
Okay, moving on to part 2 of charge question 1B. Please include a consideration of the strengths and uncertainties associated with methods related to calculating surface water concentrations. That's in section 5 for DIDP. And pause here for any questions. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands, so we can move on to part 3 of charge question 1B. For the remaining phthalates, EPA anticipates potentially needing to refine the exposure assessment for the environmental and general population. Please suggest exposure data sources, models, and related methods for estimating concentrations in environmental media, paying special attention to those media most relevant to phthalates, e.g. water, sediment, and soil. In your consideration, please keep in mind that methods, data, and approaches should be reasonably available and can be conducted in a timely fashion that allows EPA to meet statutory timelines for TSCA risk evaluations. Can pause there for any questions or comments. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. So we can move on to charge question 1C. Charge question 1C has 2 parts. So as described in section 5 of the draft environmental exposure assessment for DIDP, EPA conducted a screening trophic transfer analysis to estimate dietary exposure resulting from modeled surface water releases and air deposition to soil, including use of monitoring and biomonitoring data. The resulting dietary exposure estimates were compared to the hazard threshold for semi-aquatic and terrestrial mammals. So part 1 of charge question 1C, please comment on the methods and data used for estimating dietary exposures for ecologically relevant species in comparison of the exposure estimates to the hazard threshold for terrestrial mammals. And pause here for any questions or comments.
Dr. Cobb?
Yeah, and I could go either way. I'm curious about the committee's thoughts and EPA's thoughts. So the monitoring and biomonitoring data in the surface water is from a single watershed. And I don't know if we need to capture that in the preliminary statement or if we just capture that in the response. And I was thinking it needed to go in the statement, but the more I think about it, we could probably just handle it in the response. I'd like to know what the committee thinks about that.
Okay. Anyone from the committee has any response to Dr. Cobb?
Well, I see Dr. Ottinger's hand is up.
Yeah.
Yeah, my initial response is I agree with you, George, that we could handle it in the response, but I have an additional question that we can wait on for a minute.
So, Dr. Howdishell, is your comment on Dr. Cobb's comment?
Yeah, I agree
Okay.
that I think it can be handled in the comments, in the peer review.
Okay. All right. So, Dr. Ottinger, you can
Yeah,
tell us your
a
comment.
couple of questions for the advice from the EPA. One question would be with the ecologically relevant species, is there a running list of what is considered the ecologically relevant species, or is that left to us to designate that? That's one question. And for the part two, or II, that we'll get to in a minute, just the same comment along the lines of Dr. Chazon, which was that if there could be a priority list of the relevant phthalates that are being considered high priority, that would be very helpful.
Hey, this is Jennifer Brennan, US EPA. To the ecologically relevant species question, so that would be any animal in the United States that represents wild populations. So we don't capture domestic animals or pets, livestock in that.
Right. My question comes from the fact that it seems there's quite a bit of emphasis on aquatic, but less on terrestrial, and that's why I was asking.
So for the DIDP draft environmental exposure technical support document, there's a trophic transfer pathway from the aquatic ecosystem to a semi-aquatic mammal, the mink, as well as trophic transfer pathway on the terrestrial path from soil going up to an insectivorous mammal, the shrew. So we represent both the aquatic and terrestrial environments with our trophic transfer analyses.
Great, thank you. That's what I needed for that. That's perfect.
This is Anthony Loz with EPA. I think for your second question, I think we can have clarification about the remaining values to that charge question.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. All right, I don't see any other hands up, so I can read the second part of charge question 1C. Okay, so part 2, for the remaining phthalates, EPA anticipates potentially needing to refine the environmental exposure assessments. Please suggest exposure data sources, models, and related methods for estimating dietary exposures via environmental media, paying special attention to those media most relevant to phthalates, e.g. water, sediment, and soil. In your consideration, please keep in mind that methods, data, and approaches should be reasonably available and can be conducted in a timely fashion that allows EPA to meet statutory timelines for TSCA risk evaluations. So you can see if there's any questions on part 2 of charge question 1C. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. I think we can move on to charge question 1D. Okay, so again, for charge question 1D, it has two parts. Before I read this charge question, I would just like to note that EPA has noted a small mistake on parts 1 and 2 of this charge question. It's highlighted here in red font with strike through. So when we reissue the charge questions after this meeting, this mistake will be corrected. So for charge question 1D, as described in section 3 of the draft environmental release and occupational exposure assessment for DIDP, production volumes for manufacturing and import/repackaging, OES, were determined using chemical data repository or CDR information. The production volumes for the other OES came from CDR and/or percent production volume or PV, percentage of manufactured DIDP used for a particular OES, as reported in the European Union or EU. Risk assessments on DIDP, since the use rate for DIDP is similar in the USA and EU. So for part 1 for this charge question, from environmental release assessments, please comment on the strengths and uncertainties of using EU PV or production volume percentages to estimate production volumes for DIDP. And pause there for questions. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raised, so we can move on to part 2 of charge question 1D. So for the remaining phthalates, EPA anticipates potentially needing to refine the environmental release assessments. Please suggest additional data sources, models, and related methods for determining production volumes that are reasonably available and can be conducted in a timely fashion that allows EPA to meet statutory timelines for TSCA risk evaluations. And pause there for any questions.
I see 2 questions, Dr. Graham.
I just want to thank you for clarifying that, because my question was going to be on occupational exposures. So just thank you for that clarification already.
Okay, Dr. Ottinger.
Hi, just again, if there are additional phthalates to be considered, if they could be specific, some suggested ones that EPA is considering.
Tony, you wish to respond?
Hey, this is Anthony with EPA. Yep, that's fine. We can definitely add the clarification for the remaining phthalates.
Perfect. Thank you.
Dr. Heiger-Bernays.
Yeah, I kept my hand up to finish this, but it was the same question as Dr. Ottinger. So thank you, EPA, for providing additional.
Okay, so Dr. Fenner-Crisp.
In this last question and the related ones in the previous 2, when they talk about all of the phthalates, might want to give the panel some sense of what the timelines are for the phthalates. The statutory timeline. Because in offering recommendations, they may think something that would have to be done in 2 years is fine, but the timeline may not reflect that reality.
Hi, Colin Beecham here, US EPA. So yeah, for under TSCA, it's 3 to 3.5 years for the risk evaluations, but we are well beyond that for the high priority substances. So we are also quickly approaching and developing drafts for those for the remaining 5 phthalates. So any of those approaches and things that you might have would be super helpful. But thinking about it in terms of, I'm not going to put a definitive time date on it, like 2 solid years or anything like that. But keeping in mind that we are developing the drafts now, and if there are that 3 to 3.5 years is really the target for not just for these, but for our future high priority substances as well. So
in other words, ASAP.
Yes, ma'am. That is correct. So thank you for the pragmatism there. So we really appreciate it. Thanks.
Okay, if there are no other questions, we can move on to the next charge question. Okay, so this next charge question is charge question 2A, relates to ecological hazard for DIDP. So as described in section 4 of the draft environmental hazard assessment for DIDP, EPA had limited empirical data available for terrestrial mammals, and therefore relied on data from controlled laboratory animal studies using human health animal models to derive a toxicity reference value, or TRV, to evaluate risk from chronic dietary exposure to DIDP. Please comment on the strengths and uncertainties of the methodology and data used to derive a toxicity reference value, or TRV, for DIDP. And pause there for any questions.
So this is George Cobb again. In the DIDP charge questions, and I waited till now because it just seems the most appropriate time to say, there's no mention of the overall risk evaluation. There's just, you talk about the exposure, you talk about the hazard, but then you never get to the there's no question that asks about combining the two. And I think that's missing from this charge question assemblage.
Tony, you have a response?
No response at this time. Thank you for that comment, though.
Well, this is more than a comment. You've given us a risk evaluation and not asked for comments on it, and the title says you're asking that's what we're reviewing. So we're not just reviewing the hazard, and we're not just reviewing the exposure, we're reviewing the risk evaluation as I understand it.
So you mean, Dr. Cobb, rephrasing the question to include both?
Well, I think maybe I'd like to hear from the committee on this. My understanding is that we're reviewing DIDP for exposure, hazard, and risk, and we're only reviewing DINP for exposure and hazard, or am I mistaken?
Dr. Graham?
I agree with you, George. I think there should be an additional question on the risk evaluation aspect.
Can I ask a clarification question to Dr. Cobb?
Anna, we can't hear you. You're very quiet.
So, hey, this is George. I was waiting on Ala to moderate, but yeah.
Well,
Dr. Lloyd?
yeah,
So-
Dr. She's going to respond.
So, introduce myself first. Hopefully you can hear me now.
Yes.
My name is Anna Lowett. I'm the Senior Science Advisor at EPA's Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics. I thought I would take a first attempt at Dr. Cobb's question. But I'm going to ask a clarification first. So you're correct, Dr. Cobb, that we have not asked a question about the risk themselves. So the risk, the RQs or the margins of exposure when you get to the human health side, for example, but instead we're focused on the data and methods and approaches to develop those. I'm wondering what question it is that you're anticipating that we would have asked, because the interpretation of those risk numbers are policy and would be included in the risk determination, which is outside the scope of the SAC. So I'm unclear what science question you would have expected us to ask.
So, for example, there's no comparison of monitored concentrations of chemicals in water to hazard values calculated in the risk evaluation. So that's an error that somehow needs to be discussed.
So that would be a methods or approach question of how we've used modeling versus in the same way that we did with the formaldehyde charge questions. We asked a couple of questions around the interpretation of monitoring data as opposed to modeling. Is that the kind of question that you think we're missing?
It could be, but it could be, but the risk, you can have done a good job with the exposure, and you can have done a good job with the hazard and not couple those properly and end up with an incorrect risk outcome.
Okay, so in the case of DIDP and the remaining phthalates, Jen Brennan, if I get this wrong, please correct me. We're using the standard approaches for evaluating the hazard and exposure to non-human taxa in the same methodology that we've used for all the other risk evaluations. Are you looking for an alternative method to do that? Are there errors in our calculations that we're unaware of? I'm trying to understand what the question would be.
I should have written a question for that. I would say something to the effect of please comment on the adequacies of the approaches and methodologies used in finalizing or in the draft risk evaluation for DIDP. Something that simple. You can be more specific if you prefer. And I'd maybe like to hear back from Dr. Chasen or Dr. Graham, since one has commented and another has raised their hand. That's the kind of thing I'm looking for.
So we have Dr. Chasen's hand. Maybe she can elaborate.
Dr. Cobb, I'm not sure to be helpful because I thought I understood this until the questions came up. But I just wanted clarification from EPA. Rereading this where it says EPA had limited empirical toxicity data available. Do you mean also like the equivalent of residue data or consumption data, or what maybe that's where I was confused. What do you mean by the data availability problems for terrestrial mammals? Is this for exposure? Is this for, I mean, it's not for setting a TRV, right? I'm confused on that. Maybe you could clarify. Maybe that's the point that needs clarification. I'm not sure.
Thank you, Dr. Chasen. This is Jennifer Brennan, US EPA. When we say limited empirical toxicity data, we're talking about for wildlife. So wild mammals, avian species. In this case, we're limiting it to mammal data. So we often look to the animal toxicity studies that our hazard assessors use, and we look at the ecologically relevant endpoints from that data set to represent our terrestrial mammal hazard in the case of DIDP here. And this charge question will appear later for DINP as well.
Thank you. That's the way I originally understood it. But are you talking about also the human consumption for the terrestrial animals for the risk? I think this is, I'm just confused.
This charge question here does not have to do with general population exposure. It's specifically for the ecological hazard portion.
Thank you for that.
Law, are you moderating this or am I?
Dr. Chasen. Or you had your hand up since last time? Then Dr. Ottinger.
Hi, the previous answer I think is probably going to be the similar for this ecological associated question, but is there any concern about using the human health animal models to do an empirical assessment for the wildlife? In other words,
I think that's a charge question.
No, I understand, but I was going back, I think, to the earlier question about the mink and the other terrestrial wildlife that had data available for them. Is that integrated into this, I guess, is the question. Sorry, my question's very confusing.
No problem. Is there a response? Yeah.
Yeah, that was not confusing at all. This is Dr. Jennifer Brennan, US EPA. So the toxicity reference value we're deriving for DIDP and again for DINP in a later charge question, that's meant to represent hazard across terrestrial mammals.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So Dr. Fenner-Crisp.
It's not working. I can't get my, oh, there we go.
Yeah, we can hear you.
I want to go back to Dr. Cobb's original question after we had the discussion on this particular one. I heard him asking whether or not we should be offered an opportunity to make comments on what is essentially sections 4 and 5. Which are the human health and the ecological risk assessments. Keeping our hands off section 6 has been mentioned by Dr. Lewin. But I think he was asking the question of whether or not we should have an opportunity to comment on the integration of the hazard and the exposure thing. And do we agree with how that was done? And and are we consistent with the conclusions the agency has made about what they have done? Is that more correct, George?
Yes, and I'm interested in other people's perspectives because, I don't claim to have all the answers or all the questions, but I'm interested to hear what others think about that.
Well, since I have my phone, I would say I would agree with you that we should have an opportunity to comment. And I can't at the moment think of specific questions, just the more general ones that I just mentioned.
Do we have a response from the EPA team?
Yeah, thanks for that clarification, Dr. Finnercrisp. So I think we're going to have to, unlike the other comments we've heard about some specific questions, requests around like adding the names of the other phthalates in and some other largely minor editorial edits for clarification that I think for the most part that we'll accept. I think on this one, we're going to have to think about it. About whether or not that's an appropriate thing to do. We are working towards a thought process in our charge questions that are more methodology and data and approach driven so that we get feedback on the application of a specific method to a particular chemical. And then we can continue to use that methodology as it applies to other chemicals. And as my understanding across the last several years of SAC meetings, many of those risk characterization quantitative approaches have already been previously peer reviewed. And so we're going to have to think about that a bit. That said, we can't and won't and wouldn't stop the panel from commenting on something. If there's a section of the risk evaluation that we're not asking a question on, but the panel has strong feelings about making comments on those sections, we wouldn't stop you from doing that. So that, to some extent, that makes it a bit open-ended. So we're going to have to think about that one a little bit with respect to how we might handle that one, but we'll think about it.
Thank you. Dr. Heiger-Bernay, you have a question?
I actually have a comment with regard to the question that George had asked, that Dr. Lowett had responded to, and others as well. I think this is similar to what we did with 1,4-dioxane, George. I think there were conversations about how, and it could be methodologically, which data which data might be best suited for combination, right, between the exposure and the hazard, so that it may not be a specific question about did we, the numbers we came up with, whether MOE or the other, but more of a, if you have these kinds of data, which are, maybe there's a priority that you would use or a methodological approach to combine these data streams. And I think that could be the basis of a charge question that could accommodate the methodological approaches that EPA is seeking, or comment on methodological approaches that EPA is seeking. But I think it should be done.
Right. So if there's no response, we can continue to the next question.
Thank you, all. We're now moving on to charge question 2B. So fate and transport modeling analyses indicate that when DIDP is released to the environment, it is expected to partition primarily to soils and sediments. Therefore, these media are of high priority for environmental exposure analyses. As described in section 4 of the draft environmental hazard assessment, no hazard data were applied for DIDP for soil invertebrates. DIMP was selected as an analog for read across of soil invertebrate hazard, as described in Appendix A of the draft environmental hazard. for DIDP. Please comment on the appropriateness of the methods used to identify DINP as an analog for DIDP. And we can pause there for questions or comments.
Okay. Looks good. No questions or comments?
Thank you, Ala. We can move on to the next charge question. So this is charge question 3A. This pertains to the human health hazard assessment for DIDP. So as described in section 6.1.4 of the draft human health hazard assessment for DIDP, the EPA has preliminarily concluded that the human equivalent dose, or HED, of 9 milligrams per kilogram, which is based on NOAEL of 38 milligrams per kilogram per day, from the 2-generation study of reproduction of Sprague-Dawley, or SD, rats, based on reduced F2 offspring survival on postnatal day, or PND1 and PND4, is appropriate for calculation of non-cancer risk from acute, intermediate, and chronic durations. Please comment on the strengths and uncertainties of EPA's preliminary conclusion. Can pause there for questions or comments. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. We can move on to the next charge question. So this is charge question 3B, again pertaining to the human health hazard assessment for DIDP. So as described in section 5.3 of the draft human health hazard assessment for DIDP, EPA has preliminarily concluded that there's suggestive evidence of carcinogenic potential of DIDP in rodents. EPA's preliminary conclusion is based on evidence of mononuclear cell leukemia, or MNCL, in male and female F344 rats, and hepatocellular adenomas in male CB6F1 RASH2 transgenic mice. EPA has further preliminarily concluded that MNCL observed in F344 rats and hepatocellular adenomas observed only in male CB6F1 RASH2 transgenic mice are not appropriate for conducting dose response assessment for human health risk assessments. Please comment on the strengths and uncertainties of EPA's preliminary cancer classification and rationale for not carrying forward rodent cancers into dose response assessment. Can pause here for questions or comments. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands, so we can move on. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to be transitioning to the draft charge questions on the draft DINP hazard assessments. Next slide, please. Okay, so for DINP, charge question 1A, which pertains to ecological hazard, as described in section 4 of the draft environmental hazard assessment for DINP, EPA had limited empirical toxicity data available for terrestrial mammals, and therefore relied on data from controlled laboratory animal studies using human health animal models to derive a toxicity reference value, or TRV, to evaluate risk from chronic dietary exposure to DINP. Please comment on the strengths and weaknesses of the methodology and data used to derive a toxicity reference value, or TRV, for DINP. Pause here for any questions or comments. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. Next slide, please. Okay, moving on to DINP charge question 2A. Now we're transitioning to charge questions pertaining to the human health hazard assessment. So in sections 4.1.1 and 4.1.2 of the draft non-cancer human health hazard assessment for DINP, EPA has preliminarily selected the HED of 12 milligrams per kilogram per day based on a BMDL5 of 49 milligrams per kilogram per day based on decreased fetal testicular testosterone production for assessing risks from acute and intermediate durations of exposure to DINP. EPA is using benchmark dose BMD estimates calculated by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And that's in the NASEM 2017 publication. Please comment on the strengths and uncertainties in the selected acute/intermediate HED, including its appropriateness for these durations. Pause here for questions or comments. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands, so we can move on to charge question 2B. So charge question 2B, again, pertaining to human health hazards for DINP. So in section 4.1.3, I apologize. See hands up.
Dr. Graham?
Wait, that's for this B. So
2B, okay.
that's for 2B. So let him finish reading it.
Sure, thank you. I'll just start reading it over. So in section 4.1.3 of the draft non-cancer human health hazard assessment for DINP, EPA has preliminarily selected the HED of 3.5 milligrams per kilogram per day. So it's based on NOAEL of 15 milligrams per kilogram per day, based on a spectrum of liver effects, including increased incidence of spongiosis hepatis, increased liver weight, and serum chemistry for assessing risks from chronic duration exposure to DINP. This NOAEL has been selected by other regulatory agencies, e.g. US CPSC, Health Canada, EFSA, ECA, to characterize non-cancer risks associated with exposure to DINP. Please comment on the strengths and uncertainties in the selected chronic HED, including its appropriateness for this duration. Can take any questions or comments now.
So, Dr. Graham.
Okay, Cynthia Graham. So in the very first sentence, you have in section 4.1.3 of the draft non-cancer. Was there another document you wanted us to review that you forgot to add there? Or is that a typo?
I apologize. This was a typo. We'll fix that.
Any other questions or comments on the clarity of the question? Okay, Tony, you can move on.
Slide, please. Okay, moving on to human health hazard charge question 2C. In the draft cancer human health hazard assessment for DINP, EPA considered MNCL in section 3.2.1, kidney tumors in section 3.2.2, and liver tumors in section 4. EPA has preliminarily determined an alpha-2 globulin mode of action, or MOA, for kidney tumors, and that there is too much scientific uncertainty associated with the incidence of MNCL observed in F344 rats to use quantitatively to estimate human risks from exposure to DINP. Therefore, EPA focused its MOA analysis and dose response analysis on liver tumors. Please comment on the strengths and uncertainties of EPA's decision to focus its cancer assessment on liver tumors. Can pause here for any questions or comments. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands, so we can move on to charge question 2D. Okay, charge question 2D. In the draft cancer human health hazard assessment for DINP, EPA preliminarily concluded that the weight of scientific evidence supports a peroxisome proliferator activated receptor alpha, or PPAR alpha, MOA for liver tumors in rats and mice. That's in section 4.1. Please comment on the strengths and uncertainties of EPA's preliminary conclusion. In your response, please include discussion of the strengths and uncertainties of available data supporting key events in the PPAR alpha mode of action, or MOA, and the scientific rationale for a threshold approach for cancer dose response. Can pause here for any questions or comments. Looks like we have one hand.
So it looks like Ella is looking at something else. George Cobb, I think you corrected it when you said it, but the third line there says ALF, not alpha. And activated receptor says ALF. It should be alpha, should it not?
Anthony Lowe's, EPA. Yeah, sorry for the typo. We'll correct that. It should be alpha.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for catching that. Okay, if there are no other questions, we can move on to the last charge question. So this is charge question 2E. So as described in section 4.8 of the draft cancer human health hazard assessment for DINP, EPA has preliminarily concluded that DINP is not likely to be carcinogenic to humans at doses below levels that do not result in PPAR alpha activation, and that the non-cancer chronic POD based on liver toxicity is appropriate. Please comment on the strengths and uncertainties of this preliminary conclusion. Pause here for any questions or comments. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. This is our last charge question. So that I'll turn it back over to Ala.
Well, thank you very much, Tony, for your presentations and for asking the questions. I was wondering if Dr. Cobb, you have any general comment you want to make, or we should finish the meeting?
No, I'm still on the risk evaluation, because there are some pretty serious disconnects in my estimation between what's in the exposure and the hazard and what's included in the risk evaluation. And I think we need to resolve those, and I don't think these charge questions allow us to do that.
Okay, so maybe we can.
And excuse me, just real quick. And there's been no one on the committee that says differently.
All right. So maybe we can have a summary of the changes that can be made for the charge questions. If the EPA team intends to make any changes, what is the summary that could be made?
Are you suggesting that while we're in this meeting now?
At least we point out which ones that there is an intention in making these changes or modifications.
Hi, this is Anthony.
Specific ones for consideration. I'm sorry, EPA, can you repeat?
Hey, this is Anthony Lowe's with EPA. I can try to recap based on the notes you've taken here so far. We did note several typos throughout some of the charge questions, and we'll of course be fixing those when we reissue the charge questions. There's also several to clarify in specific places which phthalates we're referring to when we say remaining phthalates. So we'll also make those changes to the charge questions to be clearer there. And also, I think in some of the early charge questions, I believe it was 1A and 1B for the DID charge questions, there was a request to more explicitly state that those charge questions were applying to the methods for DIDP and DINP, so we can make some of those clarifications there as well. But I see our senior science advisor, Anna Lowett, came on camera, so I'll see if she has anything to add.
Dr. Lowett?
Hopefully you can hear me. They,
Yes.
good. I think Tony explained it well. The most of what we heard, with the exception of the one that Dr. Cobb has brought up, is editorial and misspelled words and things like that, all of which make a lot of sense to change. We did get a suggested revision from ACC. We'll have to think carefully about that. I did not hear any of the panel comment on the ACC proposal. So just sort of leaving that out there. But Dr. Cobb, with respect to your question, I'm still a little bit unclear what you're asking us to add. And I think Dr. Heiger-Bernays had made a suggestion that you seem to like, if maybe the phrasing that Dr. Heiger-Bernays had suggested a little while ago, to sort of recap on that, so that we can think about what you're asking and make sure it's within the bounds of the scope, but also within the bounds of our goals, and but also transparency and peer review and all that kind of stuff. So not to call anyone out, but just trying to understand what the request is and how we can follow through, if it makes sense for us to follow through on that.
Yeah, so, and if Wendy's, Dr. Heiger-Bernays is still there, she can answer, but let me circle back to your question about the ACC. That I think there's room to answer all of those questions that they posed in the question you asked to us. The question you asked to us allows us to answer all the refinements of that charge that they were requesting. So that's my 2 cents worth, and others on the committee may have their perspectives. And I don't know if Dr. Heiger-Bernays is still here to reframe her or restate her suggestion.
I'm here, George.
Hey, can you speak up a little bit? I have a big voice.
Yeah, I can speak up.
Okay, thank you.
I can teach to a class of 500 as well. So yeah. With regard to the risk assessment, what I was suggesting, was that I concur that we need to include the combination of the two pieces of the risk assessment in the review by the committee, and we could do it in the context of what we're asked, which is methodological. What are the approaches that EPA, we could recommend to EPA to consider for prioritizing which data streams, which statistical analyses for each of the two pieces? I think you're probably thinking in terms of the exposure pieces, which get combined with the dose response components. So the question could be something like, recommendations from the committee to compile the exposure assessment elements with the dose response elements. But it has to be done. There has to be a way for this committee to provide feedback to the agency with regard to which data are used for the risk characterization or risk characterization. I don't know if that was helpful.
It was helpful for me, and I know specifically the parts that I'm trying to look at, but I'm not sure we're supposed to be necessarily debating the document here. But yeah, it's exactly that. It's which aspects of the exposure and which aspects of the hazard or dose response are you combining to ultimately determine this risk. And I think there's some things we should point out at this juncture.
Dr. Haudeshell, you have a comment?
It's just a comment. It's not so much a question. It's just I'm I guess I would like clarification from the EPA if they want us to comment on the methodology here, or are they using a methodology that's already been determined and applied in multiple previous evaluations, and what would be the additional value of commenting on that methodology if it's already been established? Thank you.
Dr. Cobb, is it okay if I respond? Anna Lowett, Senior Science Advisor. Thank you for that, Dr. Houshaw. I think in my mind, that's the challenge that we're having, is that the methods that we use for both ecological health and human health have been vetted or have been used in all of the risk evaluations since the Lautenberg was passed. And we are not proposing anything new or more refined or different in DIDP or DINP for that matter. So I don't want to sort of rehash things that have been looked at numerous times already, but getting back to clarification to Dr. Cobb, if your question is that we have multiple lines of, whether it's lines of exposure or lines of hazard, and how individual pieces are selected from those multiple lines of evidence, and how those pieces are selected and put together, is that where you're going? Because I don't want to rehash what kilo is or what a margin of exposure is. But if this is about how we weigh evidence and how we make inference and selection from a body of evidence, that's on the table for a good question.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm getting to. And here's the example. From my read, you've got 3 different aquatic exposure concentrations. And the ecological one took the least conservative of those, and therefore discarded the assessment. And if you choose either of the other 2, you don't discard the risk. Well, you might choose to discard it, but you find a risk. And that's the crux of this. And I was trying not to kind of debate this.
That's okay.
Yeah, you understand what I'm saying? But
no, I totally do.
That's the crux of my question.
Okay,
right?
got it. Okay, got it. So does pulling back out of the specifics, would your question apply, and maybe some thumbs up from the panel or thumbs down? Are you asking for something like this to be added just on the eco side because you've identified an issue you want to make sure it gets talked about? Or is this a generic issue that would apply to eco and human health?
I'm only speaking for George Cobb because I really focused on the eco side and a little bit on the human health side. I think on the exposure part, it could be both. But I'd like to hear, I think we'd all like to hear from the others on the committee for thumbs up or thumbs down.
Sure, it would be helpful also if we can have this question on the screen. Whoever
there is
sharing.
no question, that's the thing.
Yeah.
Right, Ala, this would be a new question we would have to ask.
Okay.
Which is why I'm trying to hone in on what the question is, and that we're not duplicating previous meetings and things like that, that we're doing something that's important to one or both of these or the other phthalates for that matter, or methodologically that's important for all of our risk assessments, risk evaluations moving forward.
And I did see a thumbs up from Heidi Heiger-Bernays, Dr. Heiger-Bernays, and Dr. Fenner Crisp has her hand up.
That's a question.
Yeah, I think we need to ask one question. You're saying, is it just ecological or both? So that's 2 questions. So ask one question for a thumbs up.
So the yes or no question here to answer you would be, is there an agreement with Dr. So in the request to add questions, is the request, I'm going to ask it a yes or no, is the request here for both eco and human health? I see a couple of thumbs up. Three.
Hey, folks, you got to participate.
I saw 3. 4.
4.
Keep your thumbs up. I saw 5. I thought 1.
They keep going down.
Yeah, they won't stay up.
Won't stay up. So
I got
You know what?
5.
If you raise your hand, they'll stay up. If you raise your hand, they'll stay up.
oh, the
Yeah.
little thing.
So I see a lot of hands now.
Okay.
And everybody's face is going to go off the screen if you don't raise your hand. So Dr. Lowett, Dr. Kamal, I hope you stay on the screen. Everybody's getting pushed off the screen.
I think we've heard enough yeses, that there's
Okay.
enough. So we're gonna have to, this will lengthen the time that it will take us to get a revised set of questions. You all, I hope both the panel and the public understand that, because we'll have to add, first we're gonna have to think about this, talk to our senior managers about whether this is an appropriate thing to do. And then if it's determined to be an appropriate thing to do, we'll have to write them and get them cleared and go back through the whole process of transferring information back and forth. So unlike some simple editorial edits we could turn around in just a matter of hours or days, this will add time. I just need all of you to recognize that. It's not something that we can certainly do this week. It would certainly be next week till the document would be finished.
Well, the meeting is next week.
I know, this is my worry.
Yeah.
It's already
Yeah.
Tuesday afternoon.
Well,
so we're, you know, to
So
even
other
Friday is
anything
gonna be
after the meeting is not going to be included, you know, in the report or in the peer review. So we have to state it during the meeting.
Right. Well, do the best you can to get the question to us. And this is part of the reason I've pushed for these meetings to be earlier in the process.
Yes.
Okay. So are the hands is from agreeing or their questions? If Dr. Crisp has a question.
I have a question or a comment.
Okay.
Dr. Lowett mentioned that didn't ask questions about the risk assessment in part because it was based upon already vetted processes. So one of the general questions could be, are these 2 particular risk assessments performed consistently with the vetted practices?
I think given the thank you for that question, Anna Lowett again. I think based on the conversation we just had, and we're unlikely to word the question that way. I think we would think about it from the weighing lines of evidence and making choices about what moves towards risk characterization, because that's a science question that doesn't reopen 10 or 15 meetings where we have people questioning previous meetings. So which
I wasn't intending to do that.
Right. I know you weren't.
We had enough of that last time.
No comment on that one.
Okay, there were Dr. Howdeshell.
Yeah, I had a question about the revisions to the charge questions. And my question is it possible that we could get an intermediate updated version that would have the clarification on the additional phthalates with the question that currently reads for the remaining phthalates? And then as there's a final determination on an additional question on the risk assessment, that could be provided when it's available. Just a question.
Anna Lowett, again, I think a simpler way to do that from a document transparency point of view is for someone on my team this afternoon to send an email to Allah listing what those are and having him distribute that to this panel, hopefully this afternoon. So you at least have that list of phthalates that we are actively working on. As you heard from Colin Beecham, our team is actively working on a number of these, and we've made pretty good progress on several. So I think that's the simplest thing and the fastest thing from a document transparency point of view. Because as Allah just said, we're already at Tuesday afternoon. We're essentially a week or less from the meeting. The less back and forth with files that we have to write transmittal memos for and all the, other things that just have to go in this process, the better, because then we can focus on the more substantive part of it. If that's okay with Allah and Dr. Cobb.
It is fine with me. I was going to suggest maybe something even shorter if it works. Are these phthalates the ones that were in the cumulative risk assessment that we did with this committee before? If so, maybe the executive summary could just be sent out to us to say these are the ones that are being considered. But I'm not sure if that's comprehensive or if that's
I'll defer to Tony, Lutz, or Colin. I mean, it would be simpler just to send the link to the documents from last year, if that cross references, and I don't want to speak for the team.
Yeah, this is Anthony with EPA. You are right. It's the same phthalates that were in the cumulative proposal.
So even if Allah just sent out the executive summary from that, it would have all of those phthalates listed, I think. If I wasn't trying to multitask, I could look on my computer right now, but I can't do this meeting and do that too.
Well, we can send the link because the report is in the docket. I can send the link to the docket and everyone can see the report there. But if any document will be sent for distribution to the SAC, we will post it on regulations.gov also for the public to see it. So, Dr. Jason, you had a question?
Anna's tasked to get an approval for the kind of rewrite that's been suggested might be heroic. If it is, Dr. Cobb, she's already said that we can answer basically whatever question we want as part of our response. So this question infers the kind of question structure that you and Dr. Hager-Bernays articulated. So is there any reason why you couldn't try to answer the question as presented and discuss the question that you and Dr. Hager-Bernays articulated as part of the response to that charge question? Just a sort of structural suggestion.
I think something like that could work without waiting a week to try to put something together, and that would put the discussants really behind the 8 ball during the meeting to get something written. Let me see what I can put together and run it through a lot to make sure I'm okay, and then send out something to the committee asking if there are comments about this risk assessment, and then we'll try to figure out a path forward without blowing up the process.
So in case there will be modifications for the charge question, they will have to be finalized before the meeting and posted on regulations.gov before the meeting starts. So Dr. Fenner-Crisp, you have a question?
Yes, I have a small nitpick on the very last charge question, if we could pull that up again. One that dawned on me when it was still on the screen.
Okay.
It's a simple one.
I'm pulling it up right now. This is Tony with EPA.
You'll be very glad. You're asking for comments on the non-cancer chronic POD. Well, you already asked a question about that particular topic in an earlier question of its own. Do you mean when you said is it appropriate? I think you may want to add something to the question about is it appropriate for use for the risk assessment? Isn't that what you mean?
Yeah, that's correct. Essentially, is that protective?
Not so much did you pick the right one when you did it? Because that was another whole question. But you're saying because you're not quantifying cancer risk, you want to use the non-cancer chronic POD, HED for risk assessment purposes.
That's correct. Yes, we can add that clarification. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, not to beat this to death, because I think we did 180-degree from where we were 15 minutes ago. So my team is going to immediately today and in the morning work on the editorial edits. Has the panel decided that they can work within the questions that we have and make sure that Dr. Cobb's issues or other risk characterization issues that other members bring up work within the questions that we have? In which case we're not going to build a new question. We'll get those editorial changes turned around as quick as we can. Is that where we are right this second?
No,
I want to be clear because it's still a lot of work.
I know. I think we do need a refinement that includes a charge question on risk. What I was saying is, while you were doing that, I would work with the committee to determine who had thoughts on the risk assessment so that we could try to build a team of people that could respond to that charge when it got here. Does that make sense?
Okay, I'm glad I asked the question because that's not the way I interpreted what you said.
And I'm sorry,
No.
I was probably speaking across and through things and not being clear at all.
Okay. As long as you understand that to make that kind of substantive changes adds a bit more layers to the review process, and we won't be able to turn that around immediately.
Understood.
So earlier I heard Dr. Lowett say that, if you would like to comment on the risk assessment, it's okay to comment on the risk assessment, although maybe the question doesn't specifically state that. So that would be also a good alternative if you think that's okay. Just commenting on the risk assessment for when this question comes up. So Dr. Howdishell, you have a question?
More a comment. I just would encourage folks that are going to go beyond the current charge questions and providing comments that we make sure that any comments provided to EPA are not on perhaps the methodology and more on the points that were part of the discussion, the weighing the evidence, the inference, and the selection. Just in the case that there's not going to be an additional question asked.
Perfect.
And I would think that's probably correct even with a question being asked, but that would keep us out of hot water either way.
Okay, so are there any more comments about the charge questions or clarification? So I don't see any hands up. Everybody seems to be okay now. So I guess we can, Dr. Chasen, do you want to say something?
No,
Okay.
I'm sorry.
So saw your name appear, so I thought that you were going to talk. So if there are no other questions, then we can adjourn this meeting. And thank you very much for participating. And we'll see you then next week on the SAC meeting on July 30th. Thank you very much.